Good afternoon, everybody. You're very welcome to this event, very special event in the Dublin Festival of History, which of course is brought to you by Dublin City Council and put together by the Dublin City Libraries and the Dublin City Council Culture Company. We have a couple of more events this evening here in Dublin Castle. I hope many of you will stay for those. And we have plenty of events over the next 2 weeks in our branch libraries and lots of other venues around the city. And I want to thank all of you and all those who've been attending the events, because we put a lot of hard work into it, and it's great to see that returned in the size of the audience. We started the festival in 2013, and I had a hit list, if you like, of historians. And as her name is B and comes second in the alphabet, and I'm a librarian, we went alphabetically and we tried to get Mary Beard. And unfortunately, we haven't been able to get Mary over the past few years. So this year, with her new book, Emperor of Rome, Ruling the Ancient Roman World, Mary wasn't able to travel here in person, but we were delighted to have her on a live broadcast from her home. And I want to make it clear to you, you have to be on your best behaviour. We can see her, but she can see you, and she can hear you. We're going to have, is Mary's going to talk a little bit about the book. Delighted to have Zuleika Rogers from Trinity College back with us again. She's going to talk to Mary for a short while, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions, so you have time to start thinking about them. So, ladies and gentlemen, at the Dublin Festival of History, delighted to welcome Professor Mary Beard. Thank you.
That's a typical Zoom mistake, isn't it? Unmute yourself. I'd like to say how wonderful it is to be with you in Dublin. It would be more wonderful if I was there in person, but I'm hoping over the next year or so that I will get to you. And my past memories of Dublin Castle and other places in Dublin are very, very warm, that I really can't wait to come back. I wanted to start with about 10 minutes just giving you a kind of basic overview of the book, about why I wrote it, what I was wanting to do, and in a way, because although the title looks very straightforward, perhaps isn't quite as straightforward, I wanted to say, what's it about, right? And I think this is a very good moment to be saying that about Rome. I'm sure that many of you, like me, have been following this extraordinary viral TikTok sensation, which tells us that some guys think about Rome, the Roman Empire, 3 times a day. My response to that is always that I think about it all the time. But what I'm hoping that this book will do is perhaps for those who don't think about the Roman Empire quite that often, will make it rather more interesting. Now, I wonder if we could start with the first slide. I've just got very few slides. This is a bit of a rogues gallery. What I wanted to do in the book was write about the Roman emperor in a way that didn't get bogged down in individual biographies. For 2 reasons, really. One, I think, is that the biographies of individual emperors don't actually tell you as much as thinking about what emperors did as a group, you know, what they shared, what they held in common, how similar they were, rather than how different they were. And I think in some ways also, I mean, there's something kind of quite off-putting about these guys I've just put up in front of you, you know. They look kind of very similar, except the bottom row have beards. And they sort of, I think, quite frighten people away, you know, because if you think, oh, help, you know, I can't really tell my Marcus Aurelius from my Antoninus Pius, you can think that the whole of Roman history is going to be lost to you. Well, I think the job of my book is to say you don't actually need to know who any of these guys were. It's much more interesting to think about their job description, what they did, who helped them do it, what they ate, who they slept with, how they travelled around, where they lived, ... So I suppose what my my book is partly, is it's a job description for being the Roman emperor. It's not a biography of any individual ones. And I think we can feel quite confident about that approach, partly because Marcus Aurelius, there in the bottom of the second line, and still a mammoth bestseller on Amazon with his meditations, Marcus Aurelius at one point looks back at those who've come before him, and he says, oh heavens, it's the same play, just a different cast. So in some ways I'm taking my cue from Marcus Aurelius. I think it's also the case that most Romans didn't know the biographies of individual emperors any more than I could tell you the dates of Edward III of England or whoever. The individual imperial histories may have mattered quite a lot to the people at the very centre, in the court, in Rome itself. I can tell you, if you're in Roman Britain, you probably didn't give a jot about who was on the throne. It was that there was an emperor on the throne. And he's really the subject of my book, and I'm afraid it is he, not she. There was never a ruling woman. Now, if we can just shove the next slide on. This is just a particular favourite of mine. I mean, I don't really want to stop on it, but may come back to it, that I have given you the traditional marble lineup of Roman emperors and basically saying, look, they're all much for muchness. Just want you to keep in mind that they didn't always look like that, and they were represented in different media. This is one of the very few paintings that survive of Roman emperors, and it's the Emperor Septimius Severus and his wife and children. One of the children's had their face hacked out because they fell from favour later. And he's a reminder to us, partly because he came from Libya and his mother was Libyan, although his father was probably Italian. I think we want to keep in the back of our minds that these emperors, in some way, they're very similar, they're doing the same job, but they are more diverse than we might think. Let's now have the third slide. No, whoops, got this wrong. Can we flip on a little way? And again, no. Let's remove the slides. I must have got you the wrong, slightly the wrong PowerPoint. If we can take the slides off now, we'll come back to the third slide in a minute. I think one thing that I'd really want to stress is that although this looks like a book called Emperor of Rome, looks as if it's going to be about only posh old white men ruling the Roman Empire. And a friend of mine looked at the cover of the book, I'm afraid, and did say, oh, help, have you kind of changed your mind about being interested in ordinary people? I thought your kind of USP was that you like the ordinary. I'm a bit surprised to find you, going up to the top of the social hierarchy. And the answer to that is I haven't changed my mind at all. And what you find in the book, and I was hoping to find a particular tombstone in that PowerPoint presentation, but I'm afraid I got it wrong. I think the point for me is to say that nobody ever rules alone. We have this series of one-man rulers from the Julius Caesar, and I go through to the middle of the 3rd century CE, almost 300 years later. We have that series of blokes, but it's not just them who are ruling the Roman Empire. And I'm interested also in the far more ordinary people. Okay, there's hotshot administrators, there are kind of senior managers in that palace hierarchy, but what you can see is one of the things that keeps the empire on the road is actually thousands and thousands of slaves doing very specialized technical and often domestic jobs. And we know a lot more about them than we think. And one of the reasons we know about them is that they have left us. They're tiny tombstones with just their name and what they did on them. And you can start to construct the kind of the world of the palace, not just the world of the emperor. And one of my particular favorites is a lady who is called Galene. It's kind of word. It means peace, really. She's called Galene. She's a slave. And her little tombstone just says that she's the unctrix of the Empress Livia, Augustus's wife. Empress Livia, Sian Phillips in the BBC I, Claudius series. What she did all her life was she was the Empress's masseuse. And there are a whole range of these tiny jobs: the napkin carrier, the handbag carrier, the waiter at table. That what I try to do is bring them to life too, right? And to say, look, there is a whole world of the Roman people in the palace. It's not just the emperor, and you can't understand the emperor unless you understand the people who are helping him do his job. But also, and this is the last point, but one I suppose that I want to make, is that you get all kinds of glimpses through the eyes of the emperor of the kind of ordinary people in the Roman Empire that you don't usually manage to explore in their home context. Because one of the things that was absolutely crucial in the image of the Roman emperor, yeah, he was a soldier, he was a ruler, he was, quotes, sometimes all-powerful. He was also supposed to be approachable. He was supposed to be accessible. You were supposed to be able to bring your problems to him, to write him begging letters, to ask him to help you out. Now, how true that was in practice all the time, we don't know. But we do have still wonderful documents that rarely get into books on ancient history that are written for the non-specialist reader, that take you into the world of the people who brought their problems to the emperor. And one of my favorites, just to give you a quick example of the kind of thing I'm thinking about, is a difficult law case from the city of Knidos in what is now Turkey, which ended up in the in-tray of the Emperor Augustus. And what had been happening is there'd been a bit of kind of street bullying in Knidos between two particular families. And one family's house was constantly being barracked at night. So the owners of the house tell one of their slaves to go up to the first floor and to pour the contents of a chamber pot onto the head of the guys making a nuisance of themselves outside, which is exactly what the slave does, except that he also drops the chamber pot and it kills the guy underneath. Now, the authorities in Knidos attempted to make this a case of murder, and they were going to put on trial the owners of the slave for the murder of the guy who was bashed on the head by the chamber pot. The case gets through to the emperor, and we have his discussion of it, and what he says is it looks to him like legitimate self-defense and lets them off. But the point there is that this chamber pot case actually ends up in Rome, hundreds of miles away, being judged by the emperor. Let's just finish with one nice picture, which is what is the third image on the slides. It's a very nice pink image coming up. There we are. The thing I suppose I should just finish with is, what do I do about all the extreme and extravagant stories of Roman emperors that we know and love? All their, wicked goings on in the swimming pool, Domitian skewering flies with his stylus, all the things that makes the Roman Empire, I think, so memorable to us. How does that fit into my picture? Well, I think I'm going to be honest. At one point, I thought, I don't want to have anything to do with those. They're not necessarily true, right? Probably most of them aren't true. Let me not sully my history with them. I later came to see that the Romans themselves are so interested in these stories, as well as us. And what I've tried to do consistently through the book is not to decide whether they're true or not. I think probably most of them aren't. But to decide what they're telling us about how people thought about emperors. And you've got on the screen there a 19th century version of one of my favourite anecdotes, which is an anecdote of the Emperor Elagabalus in the 3rd century. He was a Syrian teenager, actually, and he invited his friends to dinner one night, and he was so generous, he poured rose petals all over their heads. But he was so very generous, and there were so many rose petals, that his rose petals actually smothered the guests and they died. That's what you can see happening here in this image. And it has come to seem to me that that is in part, a quirky anecdote about people who have power and no responsibility. And it's an anecdote about what happens if you have a silly teenager on the throne or whatever. But I think there are bigger points behind this, as behind lots of the ones that frequently get told, that is slightly more interesting than they seem. And here I think the basic point is that you can't ever trust the emperor, and you can't ever trust his emotions and his motivations. In fact, when this emperor is trying to be kind, trying to be generous, because that's what he's being, he actually kills you. The emperors can kill with kindness. You never quite know where you are in the imperial palace. And that sense of not ever quite knowing where you are in the imperial palace is indeed something that runs through the whole book, and we might come to some of that later. But that's me setting my stall out very, very briefly, but we can now get on to the main meat.
Hello, Mary.
Hello.
Lovely to speak with you again.
Great.
Congratulations on the publication of this book, for sale, by the way, outside, and only a few copies left, so I recommend it highly. I mean, I have to admit, like your friend, I was asked to do this event, and I thought, Emperor of Rome, here we go again, right? Great men, great monsters of history. Some of us of a particular generation, of course, remember I, Claudius, and they're forever in our mind. And I thought it was, honestly, I thought it was going to be that again. And I also was surprised that that's what you were interested in. But from the moment I picked this up, you took us on an incredible tour. And you took us on a tour of, I suppose, familiar spaces, but ones that we are actually very unfamiliar with. So from, the center of the palace, which of course we think we know about, but we don't, to the far reaches of the empire, like a chamber pot in Asia Minor, or mass production of images in Egypt. From the emperor, also people, the cast of characters, people from the emperor, his family, close coterie, but all the way through everyone in his world, in the palace, but also beyond as well. And I think at one stage you say, you're looking at the emperor really because you're interested in the ruler, but really about the ruled as well. And the picture you build up is vibrant, it's textured, it's surprising. Even as somebody like myself who worked in ancient history, hadn't thought about many of these multi-layers of society. And I think it's fair to say you do this because of the amount of sources that you use and the range of sources. From obviously the historians and literary sources, inscriptions, statuary, all the material culture, coins, gemstones, pastry molds. I liked the pastry molds, funerary remains, graffiti, etc., and also buildings. And what you say to us is, it's amazing actually how much we know. And we get a much more nuanced picture than usual. But as a boring historian, I'm going to start and ask you about the sources in a way, and about those sources that have really guided this usual image for us, so Suetonius, Tacitus, etc., those histories. And what you say is, look, they're blurring fact and fiction, but for them, they have a very sophisticated understanding of what they're doing. It's not like, oh, we're telling lies here to tell a good story. I mean, ancient historians write for particular reasons. Sometimes they want to tell a moral lesson. But you're saying, look, this is how to do it, what an emperor should do and should not do. So if somebody in the audience here was going out and buying Tacitus or Suetonius in their Penguin Classics, how should they pick those up in light of this book? How should they pick those up and read those sources?
I think, I hope they would enjoy them, because although, as you say, I use a wide range of sources, I still think that both Suetonius and Tacitus, have got claims to be, and this would be a quite brave claim for Suetonius, but I'm happy to make it. They have claims to be amongst the most acute historians of the Western world, actually ever. Tacitus quite often gets that accolade, Suetonius rather more rarely. I think what they're doing, in Tacitus's case, very obviously, his aim is to make us think about power. He is talking about the history of the Roman Empire from the death of Augustus, the first proper emperor, through to, although it doesn't survive, to the death of Domitian in 96. And I think we have to get out of our head that it is history in the terms that we know it, though it contains a lot of stuff which looks very like that. Tacitus is wanting to say, how does autocracy, how does one-man rule corrupt everybody? It corrupts the emperor himself, and it even corrupts those who are in opposition against him, whoever he is. I think Tacitus is, he must have been a curiously dour character to meet, I think. I don't think he was a very jolly figure. But he's sort of down on everybody. He's down on the opposition because they're so hopeless, because they speak fine words about liberty, but it's just a posture. And he's down on the emperors because they have removed what vestige of liberty there was. He's down on those who serve them. There's one glorious bit where Nero sends a slave to Britain to see what's going on, and Tacitus says, it's only the barbarians who saw that we were enslaved to a slave. Slavery is actually endemic in Tacitus as a metaphor for corrupt rule. So he is, you read him as an analyst, as a political analyst. You don't only read him as a historian. Suetonius is a bit different because he's a biographer. He's writing the lives of the first 12 Caesars, from Julius Caesar through to Domitian. And he is the source, or most actually, of the chatty anecdotes and curious factoids that always come up in Roman history, like ones I've mentioned. Domitian enjoying killing flies with his pen, Tiberius doing terribly naughty things in the swimming pool, that kind of stuff. Most of that comes from Suetonius. And he is easy to write off as a kind of chatty gossip. And most introductions to modern translations of Suetonius will tell you he's a chatty gossip. I think that's really underrating him. First of all, he worked in the palace. He was an imperial secretary, top level, kind of private secretary, and librarian. So he knew what the palace was like from the inside. But also, that gossip is trying to do some of the sorts of things that Tacitus is trying to do. And I think there's one wonderful place where you can see that very clearly, and it's the death of Nero. Nero is in the palace. The armies are revolting. One of the very, very few occasions in Roman imperial history when the armies take against the ruling emperor. And Nero sort of is beginning to see that the game's up. But then there's a wonderful, brilliantly observed couple of paragraphs in Suetonius about what actually happens in the palace as power ebbs away from Nero. And there's one lovely moment where he says, Nero called out for his servants, but nobody came to him. Now, I thought, to use a modern analogy, that reminded me so strongly of the last days of Donald Trump in the White House, where we read that people had just stopped coming into work, that power wasn't kind of thrust away, it wasn't taken away by violence, but power ebbed because no one any longer was interested in what these guys said. And spot on observation by Suetonius there.
The book starts in the prologue with stories about dining. And we saw that, that last image of the dinner party with the rose petals. And you said, and there's a whole chapter on dining that's absolutely fascinating. I mean, not just what they ate, but, you know, dining is the theatre of power, of spectacle, of terror and death. Actually, never take the mushrooms or the oysters, I think was the lesson from that. And you say in the book, the emperor's world starts in the dining room. What insights does the studying the dining habits and the dining room and the stories about the dining room and dinners and dinner parties, what does it tell us about the emperor's world and his image?
I think the dining room is almost a kind of magnifying glass onto the emperor and his friends and associates, and also onto those who cooked for him and served him and entertained him. And it is a world which is somehow enviable. I mean, we don't need to be too macabre about this. I mean, if any of us had got a dinner invitation to the Roman palace to have dinner with the emperor, I'm damn sure we'd have gone along and had it and been very proud of our invitation. So,
although Domitian's dinner was a little bit different with the...
There are downsides, but you get the invite and you think, yippee. Now, what then... The main interests of Roman writers is partly on the elaborate food, the elaborate decor, the luxury, but it's also on the terror and suspicion that comes with dinner from the emperor. And what you've just referred to is an absolutely perfect example of that. That the Emperor Domitian in the late 1st century CE has gone down as a rather unsavory character. We don't really know what he was like. But there is a story that he invited some of his, some elite Romans to dinner. And up they turn, all in their best togas, ready for a great evening. They go in and they instantly see that something's weird. And they say, God, everything is black. Absolutely everything in the dining room was black. They were served on black plates. Their couches were black, and next to each couch there was a silver slab with their name on it, but it was in the shape of a tombstone. And they were served their dinner by naked slaves who had been painted black. And all through the evening, the emperor talked about nothing else but death. Right? So they presumably thought, we are told they thought, this was the end for them. The last hour had come. But at the end of the evening, Domitian says, well, thank you very much. Bedtime now. And they leave. And they think, phew. Right. And they go back home. And they no doubt think, lucky escape. And then there's a knock on the door. And they think, oh, God, now it really is. It really, really is the last hour has come. So they go outside and they're expecting to find a hit squad. But what they find is a little group of porters from the palace who are bringing them all the goodies from which they dined, the silver tombstone that bears their name, and even the slaves who served them. So what looks like it's going to be their end actually finishes, the story finishes with the generosity of the emperor. But of course you can see why, it's very easy to see why that story is told. It's a story of aggression. It's about terrorizing members of the elite without spilling blood at all. In a way, it's a bit like Elagabalus and the rose petals. That you are scared witless in a story that actually ends with you being the happy recipient of presents from the emperor. It's a kind of sense of Well, microaggression would be putting it a bit thin, I think. It's about ingenious terrorization, but bloodless terrorization. And I think it's a reminder, and I think it's told for this reason, actually. It's a reminder that control in the Roman Empire isn't so much, it is partly, but it's not so much bloodstained control. It's not violence. It's this kind of ingenious terror, bloodless terror that keeps people on the road, really, and on the road with the emperor. And the dinner party is the source of hundreds of those stories, tens of those stories. And even in reality, I think, because that might have been a bit exaggerated, you know, I'm sure it didn't lose anything in the telling. But you spot these little vignettes of just suspicion. What's on the menu is suspicion. And there's a marvellous story of the Emperor Tiberius, who invites one of his female relatives with whom he's having a bit of a quarrel, invites her to dinner to sort of show goodwill. And he hands her a bowl of fruit. He said, "Oh, do have some fruit." And she puts her hand into the bowl and takes an apple. She then thinks, for a split second, she thinks maybe this apple's been doctored. So she hesitates for just a minute before thinking all she can do is bite into it. The emperor notices the hesitation and sees that as an accusation by her that he was trying to poison her. And within a few weeks, she's in exile. And then she's dead.
I mean, food and dining is all part of palace life. And you really depict palace life. It's quite extraordinary. I mean, it's really upstairs, downstairs stuff. I mean, everything is there. From slaves and cooks up to freedmen, advisors, elite family, etc. Incredible rich cast of characters. But you're talking about the terror. The terror also exists for the emperor in the palace as well. And you point out that actually the number of assassinations that take place in the palace, and at one stage Domitian is so suspicious, it was terribly unpopular, that he had these reflective stones put on the pillars so he could see if anyone was going to jump out and do away with them. But and you kind of depict it as a gilded cage in a way, the palace of the emperor. And I think I mentioned to you, it reminded me of Al-Muqaddasi's comment on Jerusalem. It was a golden bowl full of scorpions. And that's really how it's shown in the book. But but the court is incredibly important as well. And that is, you say it enables autocracy. The whole court and the palace life, brokering the outside world as well. How does that function?
Well, that's difficult to answer precisely. But what is absolutely clear is that in some ways the emperor is at the centre. We don't exactly know what he does there, but he's surrounded by, as it were, concentric circles of slaves and advisors who mediate him and his image and his decisions to the outside world. And it's an enormous operation. I mean, the Roman Empire is vast. It takes, from Rome, some seasons, it would take 4 months to reach the edge. Right? So he's partly governing by correspondence, but very, very slow correspondence with those elite men who are governing the distant provinces. It's very hard to see how this works in practice, because we do have one set of letters from a governor, between the governor and the Emperor Trajan, and the governor is always writing to Trajan to say, I've got a terrible problem here, the bath building in this city is falling down and I need an architect to do something about it, and or there's this very, very unpleasant sect of new religion kind of growing up here, the Christians, and I just don't know what to do about them. You know, should I arrest them? And those are going backwards and forwards, at least weekly. But the poor guy must have been deciding what to do, before the 6th month, in 6 months' time, the letter arrived. So in a sense, one kind of sees that there's a bit of smoke and mirrors here, that you write to the emperor to ask what to do, and you just hope that the reply that comes instructs you to do what by that time you've done already. But meanwhile, you have kind of endless conduits and funnels between the emperor and the different versions of his subjects. And I think, as I mentioned at the beginning, there is this very strong notion that the emperor was accessible to everybody. Now, in practice, that cannot possibly have been true. But nevertheless, it's branded into the imperial image. Lovely anecdote about Hadrian, who's out in the country, and a peasant woman comes up to him and says, "Excuse me, Emperor, I've got a question for you." And he says, "I really don't have time. I just don't have time." And she replies, "If you haven't got time for me, you haven't got time to be emperor." But I think it seems to me very likely that an awful lot of ordinary problems do reach the emperor. But I suspect, like I partly suspect with that case in Cnidos, that they're people who somehow have an in with the emperor. They know someone who is a friend of a slave of the emperor. And it's that, as all of the Roman world had always worked on who you know and who could do a favour for you and how you got your case across. I suspect that continues in this much bigger scale operation. But we sometimes see, there's a wonderful complaint that comes from Bulgaria to the Roman emperor from a village which keeps getting trashed by Roman soldiers who come in and sort of wreck the baths and do all this kind of stuff. And there's a long list of complaints comes to the emperor. At the very end, sorry, sneeze. At the very end of this list of complaints, it says that this petition was made on behalf of this village by a villager who happened at that point to be serving in the Praetorian Guard of the emperor. So you see that there are connections and wheels within wheels that sort of makes those claims about his accessibility true, but also makes them, I think, not quite as unmanageable as they would otherwise be.
Court life is fascinating, and the other thing that you set out is the actual archaeological remains that tells us about how the emperors lived and how should the emperor live? What sort of buildings should the emperor live in? And you go through the archaeology of the Palatine Hill, you look at Hadrian's villa, you look at various pleasure palaces outside of Rome, and the whole idea of the palace. And I should add, there's an incredibly useful chapter by chapter appendix at the back that not only has further reading, but also where you should go and visit as well, and what you can go and see. But the palace, it's not straightforward where they should live and how they should live, and that really develops.
Yeah, our word palace goes back to the Palatine Hill in Rome, and it is it becomes an extraordinarily labyrinthine palace, which, as you said, I think in part is a prison for the emperor, as well as a kind of boast of his power. But there's two things that really strike me about it, and this is one of the reasons I wanted to put where you can visit in. I think people don't often realise that, you can go and sit in Nero's dining room. You can track these people. You can be where the Emperor Hadrian was. You can actually, if it's open, sit on the multi-seater lavatory which was used by the imperial slaves. Right? There's loads. You can get absolute eyeball to eyeball with where these guys lived. And I think that's very exciting, and I'm always a sucker for hands-on archaeology, and there's plenty of hands-on archaeology with the emperor. It's much harder to know because it's pretty ruined. Hadrian's Villa is one of the best preserved, but the Palatine Palace in Rome is pretty ruined. It's quite hard to know what happened where. And that's not just because it doesn't survive always in the kind of detail we'd want. It's because there is a very foreign and very different set of life planning. I think, the obvious example I make in the book is, you can't find any bedrooms for the emperor in the palace, but that's actually because Romans didn't have bedrooms. They're living in a completely different world. They had private rooms where one of the things they might do is sleep, but they would also see their close confidants, hear very tricky legal cases, whatsoever. So it's quite hard to impose our vision of what a palace would be like on theirs, because it's just so very different. But there remain real puzzles. I mean, one of the things you can't find in the Palatine Palace is a kitchen, right? Now, so where all this elaborate food was cooked, we haven't the foggiest clue. But you can see in part, and particularly in some of the out-of-town houses like Hadrian's Villa, they're only 30 miles from Rome, you can see it as, you can get the picture of the stage set, and particularly, and dining rooms are one thing that we can identify happily, because you can still see where the couches were very often, where they reclined. And you see it as as a performance of being an emperor, that it's a kind of stage set. And in one of Nero's dining rooms that you can sometimes still visit in Rome, it actually has a little stage in front of where the emperor would have reclined, on which all kinds of things, all kinds of performances would have taken place. Stand-up comedy, celebrity philosophers, all that kind of thing. But you get very, very close, and yet it's also very, very puzzling. Exactly what happened where. We don't actually know where the front door of the palace was in the Palatine Palace in Rome. We kind of think we do, but it doesn't really have a front door.
I could keep talking. I have one more question before we open it to the floor, and I suppose this is the question that's really at the heart of the book, and that's autocracy, one-man rule, right? How does this happen? How does it affect the people living in the empire? Often it doesn't affect them at all, actually. I mean, that's whatever. But I think because you talk about at the beginning the importance of understanding autocracy and your abhorrence of autocracy today, and I think it's worth just exploring, because how did they get the Romans to accept this? I mean, here is a society that abhorred tyranny, right? All the writers complain about tyranny, the tyranny of the kings. They don't want, the trappings of monarchy. And yet, in a very short time, we have the acceptance of one-man rule. It doesn't matter who it is, really. No. Right? No. So it's not the cult of personality, which is very interesting, a different kind of autocracy. It's sort of the cult of a position.
Oh, it is puzzling, but you can see some hints, I think. First of all, it's Julius Caesar and pre-Julius Caesar. And one thing that is kind of puzzling in our vocabulary is, the word empire and the word emperor, because the conquered empire, in the sense of the territory that Rome ruled, was established long before the rule of the emperors. It was established when they had their sort of democracy in the Roman Republic. And in some ways, it's the problems of actually managing to deal with, hold, and at a very basic level, administer that vast extent of territory that pushes them towards one-man rule instead of what they'd had before, which is a system of power sharing where nobody held power for more than a year and they never held it on their own. And through the 1st century, before you get to Caesar, you get occasional flickers where someone is given more power than anyone else in the state for this particular military operation or something. So the democracy is perilous in the 50 years running up to Caesar. Caesar then, as it were, goes the whole hog, but for a very short time. I mean, he's only in power for about 4 years as dictator, as he calls it, and most of that time he isn't in Rome. He's killed in the name of liberty, that what Brutus and Cassius claim they want, and in the famous story is that they think Caesar is aiming at kingship, abhorred by the Romans, and they're going to get rid of him. They can't stand, for example, the idea that he has his head on the coins, complete novelty, and that his statue is going into every temple. And they do kill him. They're a pretty hopeless bunch, actually. I think they've been very lucky in having Shakespeare as their spokesperson, because they were a nasty crowd and not very efficient. And they killed Caesar, but they didn't have a forward plan. The very next year, you see that the game is up for democratic rule because Brutus is putting his head on the coins. Right? You then have a period of more than a decade of civil war, horrible, really ghastly civil war, in which Caesar's heirs take on Brutus and Cassius, and then they take on each other. And by 31, that's 13 years after the assassination of Caesar, Augustus, as we now know him, Caesar's great nephew, was the last man standing. Now, and he, as it were, steps into Caesar's shoes. We don't know what his plans were. We don't know whether he had a master plan of how he was going to rule Rome, or whether it was a series of improvisations, and very likely the latter, I suspect. But he has the good fortune that he lives for another 40 years. So you have a ghastly period of civil war, followed by a really long period of peace, at least in Rome, and money being ploughed into the city. And really, they never go back from that. Now, I think there's an enormous amount of opposition to individual leaders, right? There are plots against leaders. A huge number of Roman emperors end up assassinated. But from that point on, or at least from the middle of the 1st century CE, we see no trace of opposition to one-man rule itself. We show plenty of traces of opposition to particular one-man rulers, but not to the system. And at the death of Caligula in the middle of the 1st century CE, it's the last time anybody gets up in the Senate and says, do you know what, we could go back to the Republic, everybody. But it was too little too late. First of all, Claudius had already been declared emperor. And then people look, there's a great rousing speech. People look at the signet ring that this proponent of democracy is wearing. And what it shows is the head of the Emperor Caligula. And they think, how hypocritical is that? And never again do you hear a trace of wanting a return to the Republic. And it is, it's one of the puzzles, actually, of Rome about why that system remains so resilient when the individual holders of the office of emperor don't.
Is it anything to do with the imagery and mass media? I mean, you talk about that in the book, which is really interesting, of course, when you think today about mass media. We often don't realize that the ancient world, where there's not, there's only 20% literacy, that images are so important, and they're flooded.
And in many ways, it was the Roman emperors who invented that notion of flooding the world with their image. Caesar starts it, but doesn't live long enough. It's reckoned, and it's very much a guesstimate, that there might have been between 25,000 and 50,000 statues of Augustus in the emperor. And you mentioned the cookie molds earlier. I mean, the image of the emperor gets everywhere, and some of the most charming ones are a set of cookie molds, or we think they're cookie molds, can't think what else they can be, and they have the image of the emperor in the mold. So it's a bit like, Charles and Camilla biscuits that we've just been privileged to eat. They were eating images, they were eating the image of the emperor.
There's so many more topics in the book that I'd love to discuss with you, but I would really like to open it to the floor now for, we have some time for questions. And I know there's some roving mics going, so if you could lift your hand and if you could limit it to one question per person. I can see hands here. There's a roving mic going around. Yes, two, I think.
Yes, thank you very much for that wonderful, wonderful lecture, Mary. I've only one question. My name is John J. May, and I've been interested in this topic all my life. Why and how were from Augustus, how were they worshipped as gods? And their wives, I believe. That's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, it's one of the things that we find most puzzling about the Roman Empire, that not all, but many of these emperors, and after their death, not sometimes a bit before, but officially after their death, were turned into gods by the Senate, actually. It was the Senate's job to decide that, and then they got temples and priests. I mean, they were proper gods. Right? It is very hard to get your head around, partly because early Christian writing found that a fantastic thing to criticize Roman paganism for. They even turn their emperors into gods. And so the orthodoxy becomes, this is a very, very stupid thing to do. I think there's two things I'd say. One is that within the traditional system of Roman polytheism, where there are many gods and you can increase the number of gods, the boundary between humans and gods was not fixed in the way it is in most modern world religions. That you could cross the boundary. Hercules, for example, started out life as a mortal and ended up after his death as a god. So the system within which they're working sees a certain kind of porosity there between human and divine. I think it's worth remembering, though this goes a bit the other direction, that some Romans thought it was very funny too. And there's a wonderful skit, probably written by Seneca, who is Nero's tutor, called The Pumpkinification of the Emperor Claudius. And Claudius has died with the poisoned mushrooms, but he's been turned into a god. And what Seneca imagines in this actually hilarious skit, it's one of the few bits of Latin that's ever made me laugh out loud, He imagines Claudius going up to Mount Olympus to join the other gods, but the other gods think they don't really want him. So they send him back down to Hades, right? But it's very funny all the way, with Claudius getting his hopes up, and there's speeches in the Senate about whether they're going to let Claudius in. And I think Seneca is picking up there on the idea that it could be weird to some Romans as well.
I think there's somebody on this side.
So if I was invited to Dominant's feast and I went into a black room and he showed me my tombstone and I came back to my house and he presented all the glittering paraphernalia of the feast, would I then have to think of the archaeology of the Roman Empire, the archaeology of Julius Caesar's Trojan Empire, or the archaeology of Hercules when he met them at the Palatine Hill? Or is that what Hadrian wanted you to do when he was at Hadrian's Wall, saying, we're here?
I think a lot of Roman propaganda or Roman self-imaging is what they are saying is we're here. And they're saying we're here in all kinds of different ways. I mean, one of the long-running problems in Roman archaeology has been what Hadrian's Wall is for, because it certainly wouldn't keep out any single-minded barbarian from getting into the Roman province. And it does seem much more likely that what we're dealing with is a series of expressions of power. And you show power by putting yourself in the landscape. You show power in the way that you can humiliate the Senate. You show power in putting a road through open fields. I mean, we know that within our own world. I think just in terms of the Black Dinner Party, I think one has to say it has been written up, and it is hard to take it in any other way, as a kind of exercise in terror. You can imagine that you could have written it up as a very, very clever fancy dress party, I went to dinner with the emperor. It was so brilliant. It was a real themed dinner, and the theme was death, and we do know some other elite Romans, slightly maverick ones, it must be said, who used dinner parties for practicing for death. There was one guy who gets talked about, and he clearly was a bit off the scale, but he used to enact his own future funeral at every dinner. So maybe there's more of a tradition here of something we don't quite know about, as well as it being a kind of weapon of terror.
But ideas for Halloween entertaining anyway. So.
Absolutely. I bet there were skeletons. I mean, the thing that can I just say, what we now find so weird and so offensive, actually, is the idea that the slaves came as well as a present from the emperor. The idea that kind of the slaves had been so commodified, they'd been kind of made into a party bag and delivered to the guests. I mean, that for me is what shocks me about that story.
We have a question over here. I think there's a mic coming your way. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Mary, I've just been reading a really interesting book about the empresses, the great imperial women of Rome. And it struck me as I was going through it last night that there's quite a difference between the early Julian Claudian empresses, who seem pretty bloodthirsty and scary, and the later ones, the empresses who were the wives of Trajan and Hadrian and Antoninus Pius. How influential were they in their husbands' images, their policies, or were they?
Well,
were they pretty...
in one sense, very influential. In the sense that this was the first time once you get a ruling family, that's the first time that women get publicly recognized as vehicles of power. And I think one of the biggest changes that came about in the Roman landscape of the city of Rome with the Roman Empire, one-man rule, is that you actually started to see statues of them. In the Republic, there was a few kind of statues of mythical women from back in the 5th century and some goddesses, no real women publicly displayed. So women become prominent, and it's also true that in a family dynasty where power is actually largely exercised behind closed doors in the palace itself, you get a new way of thinking about power, and power starts to equate to proximity to the emperor. So wives have power, mistresses have power because they can whisper in the emperor's ear, so do slaves have power. The barber at the emperor's morning shave can influence the emperor, or so it is believed. I sometimes wonder quite how to take the stories of those scheming early imperial women, because it does partly look to me like a blame the woman scenario. I mean, it happens most with Livia, but there are other ones. The problem is, how do we explain why so many of Augustus's heirs died suddenly? And in the end, the man who succeeded the throne was Livia's son by her first marriage. Now, it is very easy because Roman writers like us prefer conspiracy theory to cock-up theory, it's very easy to say, aha, Livia was behind this all along, you know? Well, actually, she might have been, but she might not have been, you know? It might have been some nasty cases of appendicitis, not nasty cases of poisoning. And there is a tremendous tendency, as we still see, to blame the woman for the thing the man in power does. You know, I don't hold much, you know, I'm not a defender of Carrie Johnson, but I think that she got blamed for things because she was an easy target in the Johnson administration. And I think it's the same for Livia. It was the same for Sherry Blair and Nancy Reagan and any number.
I think there was a hand right up in the middle that came up first here. If there's
Mary, is enough attention paid to the soft power of the empire? I mean, if it was all about blood and conquest and repression and slavery, it would have lasted about as long as Genghis Khan's empire.
That, in some senses, that's a big theme in the book, that this empire did not and could not have lasted by violence. So you've got to look for other forms of acceptance of the emperor and the empire. And I think that you see that in several ways. I think that one is, despite the fact that, you know, the dissidents and the opponents of individual emperors get quite a lot of attention in ancient and modern writing, most of the Roman elite, both in the provinces and in Rome itself, most of the Roman elite were collaborators. And the Roman Empire existed by collaboration. They would have said cooperation, I expect, but it's that people went along with it. I think also there was a, you know, your soft power idea, I think, is right in a way, that the Romans have a very limited view of what kind of power they want to impose in the provinces. You know, they don't particularly care very much about what religious observance there is, for example. But they do, and this is where the statues come in, they do manage to brand the empire with the figure of the emperor in ways which I think, it makes him seem inevitable, I think. It makes him seem, you know, this is in inverted commas, it makes him seem natural. And I think soft power has to have a lot to do with it. And in the city of Rome itself, well, soft power is the chariot races, and it's, you know, there's almost 250,000 people can get into the Circus Maximus to watch the races, bankrolled by the emperor. And, you know, that's quite a bankroll.
I think we have time for one more question. Is there somebody on this side? Yeah.
Thank you, Mary, for a wonderful talk. It's a question I gave to Mr. Holland on Friday evening on a similar subject, and I don't intend it to be provocative. I am genuinely interested in your view. I was in the British Museum about 10 days ago with my daughter. Now, I will cancel the fact, I felt there was a lot of loot there. I'm just interested in your view on having artefacts in different countries in somewhere like London. And by the way, I'd say in Dublin Castle with the Chester Beatty Library here, so we're not pointing fingers to say we're any better. I am genuinely interested in your view.
No, my view, are you going to claim that I'm being a boring academic? But I think issues of movement of objects or restitution of objects have become, they've become questions that we have to face. You know, you can't say, as I think in the past, there's been a tendency to say, oh, it'll go away, you know. But I think that in order to face them, you have to say two things, really. What do we think museums are for in the 21st century? You know, they're 18th century institutions, I mean, ultimately Roman, but not really. 18th century institutions, what are they for in the 21st century? Because I don't think you can start to think about particular objects and their fate, etc., until you know what you want that institution to do. And a subset of that, I think, would be, I want to know can we really sit down and think about a bit harder about how we share these objects of great world heritage? And I mean share. And that probably means, you know, getting less hung up on ownership. But I want to, you know, when we think of some of the kind of absolutely classic contested cases, I see the importance that some of those have for their, the countries where they were made, although often they were quite different regimes when they were made. But if these things are global heritage, I want to think how to make them global, and how we can move them, and who can see them, and how many. And, you know, to be honest, I don't think that means that they can just stick in Bloomsbury, and we can, particularly in global warming and climate change, etc., we can say, oh, you can all come to Bloomsbury, come to London to see them. I don't think you can sustain that line any longer. But I think we've got to think hard about what we would like the future of these objects to be. Judicious, eh?
On that note, I think we're going to draw this session to a close. Mary, on behalf of everyone here, thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, thank you.